Hello again, students. We're already at Module 2. This is exciting. Your thoughtfulness in your class discussions and responses in your assignments speaks to the passion you carry in everything that you're doing. We're so lucky to be learning together. Let's dive in and see what more is in store. First off, nice job on completing our class values and norms. I put them here in this document so that you can see the kind of classroom culture we are trying to create and can uphold and support each other in this effort. This will be helpful as we complete each module. Please note that this module covers 4 chapters. That's right, 4. You will also have 3 weeks to complete assignments and participate in class discussions, which we will use the Padlets to generate the discussions. These spaces of discussion, especially the Padlets, I hope you will go back to during the course to deepen your own understanding by reflecting on what others have shared, and to use the Padlets as resources for your midterm and final. You have 3 assignments this week, which we will go over. As always, there are resources here to help you read and comprehend each chapter. Please utilize these resources to help you through this module. Let's go into this module's presentation through this link. First chapter will look at the dynamics of families during adolescence. I want to highlight 3 areas in this chapter. First, let's look at the different temperaments adolescents have, which can impact family dynamics. Often, in families where the dynamics are not constructive, we can find ourselves in a model as this one. This model looks at what can happen to families when communication is not strong and emotions do not find healthy expression. In this model, family members take on roles. It begins with the victim. Victims in this case are not people who have been unjustly assaulted or children and youth who are abused. Those are true victims in every sense of the word. In this case, a victim is someone who does not want to take responsibility for who they are. Instead, they need to find someone to blame for why they are in the situation they're in, or why they feel so miserable. And that's where the role of the prosecutor or the bad guy comes in. The bad guy is the one that the victim blames for their misery. In other words, they make them feel guilty for the victim being in the position they're in. You can imagine this could play out between a parent and an adolescent. If the parent says to one adolescent, "Why can't you be like your brother or your sister? Or your cousins are doing so well in math. Why can't you do well in math?" In other words, they blame them for not being who the victim wants them to be, or even just for making the victim happy. This is where the other role plays against the persecutor, and that's the rescuer. The rescuer is the person that plays into the victim's needs. It could even be the persecutor changing roles after being blamed. They could feel guilty, and then they might respond to their mom and say, "I'm sorry, I'll do better next time," and in this way try to appease the victim. The rescuer could be another adolescent in the family, or another adult even, that might agree with the victim, again, to pacify them, and say something like, "Why don't you just listen to your mother? Why can't you just make her happy?" You can see how destructive these roles are. Based on temperaments, each individual might take a particular role and play this out with her family until they find another way of communicating and managing their emotions. What's important to remember is that all the roles are lies, and they only cause pain. This brings up another area I wanted to highlight, and that's the relationships of adolescents with adults. Oftentimes, adolescents are viewed as being rebellious or indifferent to adults, in particular to their parents. Nothing could be further from the truth, as most research indicates that adolescents crave a healthy relationship primarily with their parents or caregivers, and then with adults in general. It is a healthy relationship with an adult that could make the difference between an adolescent moving successfully through difficulties during these years or not. Finally, this brings us to the third area I wanted to emphasize, and that is parenting styles. The book in particular talks about 4 parenting styles: authoritarian, uninvolved, permissive, and authoritative. And generally, parents will fall within maybe a blend of a couple of these, though they will primarily stay within one style. Again, this could be in part to the parent's own temperament, and/or also their child's temperament. In other words, they might be more authoritarian with one child and more permissive with another. It's important to note that of all 4, the most dangerous is uninvolved, as this is the one in which adolescents could potentially receive the message that they're not important, and that during adolescence can be very dangerous. It's also important to remember to think about the cultural lens each parent is utilizing when parenting their children, and for us not to assume that a Western style of parenting is automatically the correct parenting style. What could be viewed as authoritarian through a Western lens might actually be authoritative if you could use a different lens. What's most important is the adolescent continues to find a voice within their parents' parenting style, and that they feel loved as they develop and move forward. It's important to also note how in this chapter it talks about arguments had within families. Please take a look to delve deeper into the research on what adolescents truly argue about versus the stereotype. When speaking of parenting styles, you cannot ignore that some cultural differences are not necessarily by ethnicity, but rather looking at them from a socioeconomic lens can also have an impact on adolescent success. Of course, a great deal of research has been done on low socioeconomic communities and how the economic gap impacts parent stress and thus their parenting. I would also suggest that maybe enough research has not been done on higher socioeconomic families and their parenting styles, and how that might also stress students. However, because the low socioeconomic community is also largely impacted along the lines of ethnicities, I think it's important to dive in a little deeper and ask why. This brings us to an examination of historical and institutional racism that created unequal neighborhoods and disproportionately gave an advantage, in this case, primarily to Anglo-Americans, in their economic and neighborhood stability. I'd like you to watch this video that addresses the concept of redlining and also explores the GI Bill. You will see in the notes of this slide there are links to other videos if you'd like to explore more. I'd like you to think about how this impacts the stress of a family going through these experiences that are unjust, and how over time that stress would impact their ability to parent effectively and thus impacting family life. Finally, many of you have expressed an interest in entering the educational system, and it would be remiss to not think of how our parents engaged in our educational system, in the learning environments of their adolescents. With this in mind, I want to share with you some resources that you might begin exploring and thinking about how families could also think about their own learning cultures, as teachers are doing in their classrooms. This resource, 6 Keys of Parent Involvement, were developed by Joyce Epstein. A link to her work is in the notes of this slide. You may want to explore what she says about the many ways in which parents are engaged in their child's learning, as we commonly think of volunteering as the most engaged type of parent involvement. In reality, it is a type 4, learning at home, which includes helping with homework, creating a homework space, reflecting with adolescents about their day, talking with them about what they're learning. This is considered the most impactful parent involvement types. This leads us to the next chapter, peer groups. Along with your reading, I want you to consider how adolescents view their peers in light of the way that teachers interact with students differently. This video is a project in which students in Alabama were asked to share their insights on why African American students were doing so poorly compared to their white counterparts. You might find Amari's reflections not only insightful, but also very painful to consider this is a reality that adolescents have to walk through. In light of this chapter's readings, you might also want to consider how this impacts relationships between peers from different ethnic groups, and then of course we can begin considering solutions. The book also talks about bullying, and I want to expand a little on cyberbullying, as this is a phenomena that is relatively new for our school system. Something to consider is the difference that we often attribute to a virtual reality versus a physical reality. Often, when working with schools, I will ask teachers and administrators what will happen if a fight broke out in a cafeteria, and inevitably, they will tell me that they run in to break up the fight and help the students sort it out. What schools do when they don't like an app, and how students are engaging in this app, is they block it from the school's internet, and then they say, "There, that's all done, problem solved." Of course, we know it's not all done. Students are still fighting in that app and in that virtual world, and desperately need help. It would be equivalent to saying, if a fight breaks out in the cafeteria, just close the doors, and there, it's done. It's not happening anymore. We know this is not the case, and a different approach needs to be done for virtual reality as well. To explore this further, I want you to take a look at this video from Common Sense Media. Again, the link is in the notes. Common Sense Media is a wonderful resource, and you can use it for your bibliography project. Please take a minute to explore the video, reflect on the questions, and then post your answers to your Padlet. Our third chapter is on schools, and this brings us to the huge change that is happening in schools. This slide can help you see the reality of this change. In our old school model, it was a model of compliance, which made sense for the industrial era. You will see the skills that students had to develop were really completing tasks, consuming information, memorizing, working in isolation, and it was dependent on the teacher and students answering when they were asked. Of course, the teacher was the center of the learning, as they were the ones that told the students the information, and this was expressed in a linear fashion. They were also presenters, and were also compliant to whatever the system was asking of them. We are now moving into an innovative learning space. And of course, with this comes a great deal of shifts and changes. It's much more active, and it's a learning environment where students will create and become producers of information. They have to process and collaborate with others. It requires a great deal of profound reflection, and they work in an autonomous way, but they can also ask questions. Of course, this would change the teacher's pedagogy. The teacher, rather than being the center of learning, is focused on the student and empowering the student's own learning. So the teacher is a collaborator of that learning space. They listen more, they customize to help each student learn independently according to their needs. They're facilitators of learning rather than presenters. You can imagine that this is a huge shift for all of our schools, and so this of course leads many schools to wonder, what should we teach? And you will see how from an industrialization era to urbanization and immigration, there is such flux and change of not only students, but also of environment, that many schools have realized the need to reform. In reforming schools, there has been an increase of concern, as the book points out, of inner-city communities and urban school districts. However, something alarming is beginning to occur, and that is that education in inner cities is highly impacted by suburban violence. I want you to watch this video on how the zero tolerance policy developed and how this policy impacted low socioeconomic students when the cause came from affluent students and affluent communities and schools. I would also like you to reflect on this Padlet. on how perceptions about certain communities